All right, good morning, everybody. Hi, welcome to another edition of Data is Love. And I'm super excited to welcome my friend and co-conspirator and community builder extraordinaire, Megan McNally. Welcome.
Thank you.
Uh,
Hi, Aparna.
Hi. Okay, so it's March, it's Women's History Month, it's so many things. And this month on Data is Love, we're talking about community, right? All of the communities that we're a part of, how they evolve, what purposes they serve. And you've built one that I feel like is a rock for so many female entrepreneurs in the greater Seattle area. And so I'm just wondering if you'll start with telling us a little bit about who you are, because you're more than just a community builder. You have like 17 businesses. um, who are you, and what is the community that you've built, F-Bomb Breakfast Club?
Well, I'm a busybody, clearly. First, Aparna, thank you so much. This is really fun to have this conversation with you. And as I told you in our pre-show, I don't like to do things like live streaming like this. It scares the hell out of me. So this is a testament to how much I love you and how much I respect the community that you are building, particularly on LinkedIn here. So so I'm Megan. I am in Seattle. I'm a business attorney. I'm a strategy consultant. I'm an angel investor. There's a handful of things that I do and a handful of ways that I support businesses and organizations, which really is what my career has been about. And I think you're talking about the F-Bomb Breakfast Club, right? So the F-Bomb Breakfast Club started because I had a need, right? This was almost 8 years ago now. I was trying to scale a corporate law firm. I had a vision for scaling it. I was trying to figure out how to do that. And I was working on a little side project that had to do with sports. And so I was operating in two very male dominated spaces. And I found that every time I showed up into a business community to just try to connect with people to sort of learn, what is that secret sauce of scale, I was dealing with a lot of gatekeeping, a lot of patronizing, not information, right? But that like, oh, good for you, lady. And what I found is when I talked to other women who were also trying to build things, particularly build things in male dominated spaces, that my experience was not unique at all. There were a whole lot of people who had an experience similar to mine. And so I literally just wrote a blog post and said, look, if there are any other women in the area where I live, which is Seattle, that are trying to build something, trying to figure out how to scale, you're doing it in a male dominated industry and you want to get together and talk about it, I'll provide the coffee and donuts. You just have to wake up early because we got to get this done before the business day starts. Once the day starts, I'm in the hustle. So let's do it. And it just turned out that it resonated.
Yeah, I think I attended my first, possibly the only F-Bomb Breakfast Club meeting, maybe 5 years ago now, 5.5 years ago, at the Impact Hub. And so many people were awake at 6:30 in the morning. People were awake.
Yeah, that's right. We met. I'm gonna do a little bit of swearing on LinkedIn. I'm gonna try not to do very much, but we started as an in-person meetup, and we met on the first fucking Friday of every month at the Ass Crack of Dawn, which made it just very easy for everybody to remember. And it was an average of 157 women that came in person for a meeting that started on time at 7 a.m. in downtown Seattle. We did that for years until the pandemic drove us online.
And okay, let's rewind for a second. 150 women gathering on average once a month on a Friday, based off of a blog post where you're like, hey, are you struggling like me? Do you want to be in community? Let's hang. And how un-Seattle of you to bring donuts. I'm sure they were gluten-free, vegan, dairy-free,
They were crap.
filled. You were like, you're gonna eat sugar and refined flour at 7 o'clock in the morning.
Yeah.
What was the purpose, right? Because I feel like it had to be more than I'm in the struggle, you might be in the struggle as well, right? Because my experience of the F-Bomb Breakfast Club wasn't that it was like a place to just come and vent. It was more.
Yeah. Well, so a couple of things. One is that I did not intend to build a community. I set the table for people to come have a conversation if anybody else was interested in that conversation. And community grew from that because what we discovered is that we had things in common that we wanted to talk about and that we cared deeply about each other, right? And the other thing is that I wasn't doing it alone. I wrote the blog post by myself. I had a conversation that I wanted to have, and I wanted to find other people who wanted to have it. But the people who shut up in the beginning are really, who built F-Bomb. They really did. There were people who showed up consistently month over month over month, and we became a community that grew a community. And I think that is sort of one of the hallmarks of many successful communities.
Okay. How has F-Bomb grown in the last couple of years?
Yeah. So F-Bomb so a couple of things. So one is it grew really fast in the beginning, like word spread like wildfire. Some of that had to do with timing. This happened to coincide with the greatest threat to American democracy in our lifetimes, which was the election of someone who had no business being in the White House. And that person was a raging misogynist. And a lot of women felt like the gauntlet had been thrown down, and they were looking to connect with other women who were not willing to apologize for taking up space, and just in particular in the business world. So timing was, a big part of how it resonated in the beginning. And then we also learned kind of quickly, oh, this is becoming a community. We better learn what that means and what we need to do. And we started taking advice from people who knew what they were doing, who told us things like, you've got to be really clear about who it's for and who it's not for, if it's going to be really valuable for the people who come there. So we started learning and putting practices in place, and we found that there were things like having rituals that people could recognize, consistency in what we did and how we did. Like, we always met at the same place at the same time, so you never had to figure out logistics. Those things made it easy. It reduced the friction to come be a part of it. And then we put some things in practice that I think were unique to us. When we met in person, there was always somebody at the door to welcome you the second you showed up. So nobody ever had to walk in and feel awkward and look around. Like, where do I go? Do I know anybody? Do I sit down? Somebody opened the door for you and said, we've been fucking waiting for you. Come on in, right? And that created that feeling of belonging. So in the first year, we went from 19 women I'd never met before to over 1,000 within the first year. When in the pandemic, when we shifted online, we went from something like 3,000 to over 5,000 in a pretty short amount of time. So there were a few sort of inflection points where we grew a whole lot. And at our height, we were about 6,000 members.
That's incredible. That's incredible. That is incredible. I mean, as somebody who has done a lot of community building in the last decade, it's a lot of work to go from 90 to 6,000. That is and like 6,000 sticky members, right?
Yeah.
Not 6,000 people who are like, I'm in this community and it's like Reddit,
That's right. Yeah. What is a community, I think, is really important. So while we had 6,000 members, all 6,000 were not engaged at the same level, right, in the same way all of the time. But we measured members by whether they participated, not just joined the Facebook group, right?
Yeah.
And so I think, one of the things, when you're talking about community, I think one of the things that's important to talk about is, what is a community? What do we even mean by that? How do we define it? Because there's really different types, right? There's the communities that you join intentionally, like F-Bomb. I think it's a thing I want to be a part of. I'm going to give them my information. I'm going to make sure it's a fit for me and I'm a fit for it. And then I'm going to sign up and I'm going to go in, right? Then you're a member of that community. Then there's the communities that are really just, there's something we feel, right? I support startups in the Seattle area in a variety of ways. I feel a part of the startup community. There's no membership card for that. It's a feeling. And then there's communities that other people claim for you, right? And those can be like brand communities. I love the Seattle Storm. I buy their merch. I go to the games. I engage on social media. They would call me a member of their community. When we address, like LinkedIn, a great example. Last week, you posted a reintroduction to yourself and you called us your community. You claimed us. We might not know we've opted into your community but we have behaved in a way in which you've sort of recognized us as part of a community. So there's many different kinds of communities and ways that they organize.
Yeah, claiming community, opting into community. I think I want to go back to what you said earlier, because for anybody who's listening in, I think it's helpful to like reiterate the key points. This is like the former teacher in me. You have to say it 3 times in 3 different ways. But I heard you talk about welcoming people,
Mhm.
right? I heard you talk about having rituals, and then having consistency. And I feel like this is also this is also what makes relationships work.
Mhm.
This is also what makes relationships thrive, right? Like being open, um, having relationship rituals, right? Which I think, like, whether they're platonic or romantic, it's so important. And consistency.
Mhm.
What are we doing? When are we gonna do it?
Yeah.
I don't want to have to like wonder, or and I feel like those are the things that are so often missing when I think about this evolution of community that I've seen happen in the world. They feel really kind of gimmicky and markety to me. And also, I like switching gears a little bit into the kinds of communities that I've seen spring up in the last 3 to 5 years, with like really big membership fees, which is very different than a community like, let's say, F Bomb, which I built Future for Us a couple of years ago. It was low friction, low cost, low or no cost, right? Versus like Achieve, that's like
Mhm.
$8,000 a year. Or I think like a community that I wanted to be a part of for so many years, The Wing, also like many thousands of dollars a year in membership. And I'm just really curious, like, what are the differences in those, and like
Yeah.
this. I will say it's like monetization of communities, but maybe it's not.
Yeah. I mean, a couple of things. So one, monetizing communities is not new, right? We just called them membership associations before. We've Humans like to think we're not joiners, but the data doesn't support that, right? Belonging is pretty important to human nature.
Yeah.
And most of us do join different kinds of communities where we feel valued, where our needs are met. And so paid
Hmm.
communities is not new.
Yeah.
The trend that you're observing is how the internet has changed that. How many communities are online now, and how easily discoverable they are. And when community is the product, like any product, it is only successful if there is a market begging for it and willing to pay for it, right? And so when I think of some of these high-priced communities, um, if the price feels high, that's because the value isn't for me, right?
Mm.
If it
Hmm.
exists and it's thriving, that's because it is meeting somebody's needs, and we all have different needs that are met in different ways. But another thing about paid community that I think is important to understand is that communities take work. They take a lot of work. Usually, you don't see that work. Often, that work
Yeah.
is behind the scenes. And in a capitalistic society, there is always a risk of exploitation. And one of the things that I think is really important to ask is, whose labor am I benefiting from? And so sharing the cost of community is about recognizing and valuing the labor that goes into it if that community is delivering value to you. So that's one model. When it's, and then how much to charge, whether it's free or you pay something or it's actually a high ticket, those are indicators of who it's for and who it's not for, which is part of how you create value. And if it wasn't valuable to somebody, they wouldn't be paying that price. But nothing is free. Nothing is free in capitalism, right? If you saw, LinkedIn, I shared a New York Times essay yesterday that
Yeah.
I read thanks to Ruby Love, who posted it on LinkedIn, and then I, saw it, and it's about credit cards rewards programs, and they seem like they're free to us, and I get fantastic perks. And oh, it turns out it's yet another tax on folks who don't have the same income or means that I do. And it's true for community too. If you join a community and it is free, I promise you it's not free. The question is who's profiting and are they being transparent about it? Whether it's a consumer brand or a sports team or an investor or whoever is hosting the community, if they aren't charging you an upfront fee, I promise they're benefiting in some way. You might not know it or understand it. I think Facebook, in some ways, in the past few years, kind of blew the lid off of that, and we all have an understanding now that we're paying the price in some way or another. But actually paying a fee, whether it's a joining fee or membership fee, I think is one way that is transparent. There's a transparent value exchange instead of a hidden value exchange.
I like that, a transparent value exchange. You said earlier, if the price feels high, the value isn't for me. And so, this is not a question that I sent you ahead of time, but what it's making me think about is, and I'm with you, by the way, on the if something is free, someone, right, like something's amiss, because nothing really is free. It takes time and it takes labor to build anything and everything. And how then do we create greater equity? How then do we keep communities from perpetuating segregation and, right, like systemic inequities?
Yeah, it's a great question. I don't know that I have an answer to it, but I think transparency is one tool, right, for accelerating equity. So that clarity about who's benefiting, who's doing the work, are they getting paid for it? And there's different and when we talk about equity too, there's different kinds of equity. So, for example, in FBOM, in the very beginning, it was all volunteer labor, and I underwrote the costs. I just bought the coffee and donuts until we
Yeah.
switched to bagels, right? And I did that every month. And then so many people started showing up, and we're showing up over and over again. It's like, this is not very sustainable. And so, then we put a pay what you can price on attending once a month. And that allowed us to underwrite the hard costs of the space and the food and the coffee. And then it allowed us to start paying a stipend to speakers. So we always tapped, I believe that in a community, the experts are in the room. And so you find the experts in the room and then elevate them to share that expertise. And
Yeah.
that is work. So so by beginning to charge a price, we were able to recognize that work has value. And even though it has always been a very modest honorarium, it might be $50, it might be $100. In the beginning, it was enough to cover people's parking. We'll give you $15. If
Hey,
you want to be on
that is real. Downtown parking is expensive.
Yeah, but it was a way to recognize and start to value labor and start to try to create equity, within the community. And that became an enduring value, that when we ask something of somebody, we pay them something. We give them, something in exchange for it. And trying to be transparent about that is one way that you get to a more equitable community. But that doesn't solve everything, right? Racial equity is something we think about and talk about in FBOM. I started FBOM. I'm a middle-aged white lady. A lot of the people who have joined look like me and have similar attributes to me. It is an effort not to center our needs all the time. So how do we think about that? How can we be intentional about that? Those are things that I think of FBOM as a learning community. We're constantly trying to learn and get better and improve, but we have to be accountable. We have to name it as something that's important and be accountable to it.
How did you get more people that don't look like you in the room for FBOM?
Yeah, I don't think I got them to. I think it goes back to, is it valuable for people? I have tried really hard, sometimes more successfully than others, not to be the first face that people see when they come into FBOM, or the only face that they see is one thing that's important. When we built panels, we have been really intentional not to build all white panels of speakers. We've been really intentional in how we've cultivated a community. First, we had a community of community leads. Then we had, a community of online moderators, our FBOM mods. So we've always been really intentional about those things, and then we ask and we try to respond to what people need. So, as an example, the first year that we held an annual retreat online, it was the first year of the pandemic in 2000.
I was there.
Yeah. And one of
Yeah.
the things we did is we asked people when they registered for it, would we have an idea to create a caucus for women of color who join the retreat. It will be a private space that you can go into to speak with other women of color. Is that something that's important to you? So we asked people and they said yes. So we hired somebody. We paid a moderator to create a Slack channel and to be the host for a community of folks who we wanted to signal it's important to us, and we recognize that you might need space away from the rest of us at times during this retreat, and we want you to have that space, and we don't think you should have to do the work to find it. So we'll provide those resources. So I think doing things like that then help people feel that the community had meaning to them and they wanted to be a part of it. And then any community that's successful grows by word of mouth. And so then if people come and feel seen and valued and they're getting what they need out of the community, then they tend to tell other people like them in their community. And so in that way, I think people started coming by word of mouth.
Yeah. Oh, I feel like I have so many questions. Okay. But I want to ask you for your candid opinion on communities inside of companies, because you also have a law practice and you also have a consulting practice where you're supporting leaders make decisions, essentially, right?
Yeah, in my consulting practice, I do a lot of strategic planning, governance related strategy, and community. I work with a lot of membership-based organizations to help solve some of those challenges of membership. Yeah.
So the kinds of communities that we see at work, I mean, I feel like in the last couple of years, we've definitely gotten a vocabulary around employee resource groups, right? ERG, sometimes they're called business resource groups or affinity groups, typically for folks that are underrepresented in the organization or in society at large. There are definitely membership organizations. And so I'm just curious, what are best practices? You're working with a lot of different kinds of organizations.
Yeah.
What makes communities inside of organizations successful?
Yeah, it's a great question. And I think, there are people who are more expert than I am particularly on employee resource groups. So I just want to name that. Yeah. But I think some of those best practices are, first of all, who's driving the agenda? Is it the employees themselves who goes back to those different types of community, the one that you intentionally join, the one that is just a feeling, and the one that somebody else has claimed you, right, as a member of. And so what are they? When they are driven by employees who feel community with other employees and actually raise their hand and say, we need space for this. And the company supports them and allows it to be driven actually by those employees, that can be a recipe for success. When the employer turns to those employees and says, what do you need? How can we support you in building this community? And then provides that and gets out of the way, that's a recipe for success, right? So those things are really important. When it's community or employer driven, that's when I have concerns, right? We would like to invite all of you who have this couple of things in common to come together. That goes back to who's profiting from it, who's benefiting. There's an interest that the employer has in you getting together and something they want to learn about you, what you say yes to, how you show up, what kinds of things you talk about. They're benefiting from that information in some kind of a way. Now, it doesn't have to mean that's negative. It could be, gosh, we want to understand how to do a better job. So in the tech industry, let's talk about just keeping women in tech, for example.
Yeah.
So your employer has an interest in understanding, what do you need? What would make this a place you want to stay and grow your career? And so that might be their interest. But if there's not transparency about who's setting the agenda and what the intention is for the community, then it can be difficult to really make that a success. And then another thing I think is so important is transparency about whether what happens in that community is confidential, right? So is it a space where employees can show up and talk about things candidly, without filtering and without fear of recrimination? Because even if that recrimination is illegal, which it is, that doesn't mean there aren't subtle and hidden ways that it happens all the time anyway. And so there really has to be, if you're going to set the table, clarity about the rules at that table. And I think that's probably one of the most sort of imperative ingredients of a successful community within a company.
You use the word recrimination, and I'm just gonna say most of us are not attorneys. What does that mean? What does that mean?
Yeah, thank you for calling me out on that. It means that you're punished in some way, right? So there are certain laws that prevent specific kinds of penalties against employees. If you are a whistleblower, federal law protects you from being fired by nature of blowing the whistle on, certain kinds of activities. But the implicit ways or the hidden ways that recrimination happens, what I mean by that is that you are punished. Your opportunities to advance in the company start to become limited because of
Yep.
what management has heard you say, or
Mhm.
because they fear the influence they see you developing among other employees. So that's what I mean. So recrimination really just means punishment. Like if you're going to if you build a community of employees that you share something in common with, and you go into that space and you share something candidly because you believe this is a safe space to talk about it. Let's say you are, that it is an affinity group of women working in a particular department within a tech company, and you think that's a safe space, and you go in and you do need a place to vent where it's like, I am the only woman on my team of XYZ kind of
Mhm.
developer, and our, and whatever, our first meeting of the day is always at 7 a.m. And I'm the person with primary responsibility for getting my kids to school, and I'm never going to be able to be the first person in that meeting. Gee, it's so frustrating, right? And you're sharing that and you're hearing from others how they deal with that particular issue. And then your manager finds out that you complained about that. And then they're looking at an opportunity to advance. And they're like, well, we don't want to pull Megan on that team because, she can never make those 7 a.m. meetings and she complains about it, blah, blah, blah. So we're going to pick Bob instead, right? So that's recrimination. You start to lose opportunity. You're penalized in some way for the things that you share or that management has heard you share. So that's why I think it's important that, if you go into a space and you know that management is going to be privy to what you talk about, you're going to show up differently.
Differently.
And then you are, if you know that this is a safe space where you can talk about things and that the things you talk about will not be used against you.
I feel like I was today years old when I realized that it can actually be really helpful to have a lawyer present when you are thinking of setting up communities inside your organization, because I don't know that it's actually that well understood by leaders in an organization that you can't penalize folks for gathering and talking about any number of things, but in particular, things that create inequity in said organization. And yet, I think, at least in my experience of living and working in the United States as a brown woman, I think that that's often what does happen is that organizations do penalize Black and brown women in particular, but Black and brown employees at large, queer folks, if there aren't really clear boundaries around like welcoming and like just also like legally responsibilities towards LGBTQ folks, like along so many dimensions
Yeah.
of diversity, right?
Yeah.
It's happening.
Well,
Okay.
there are protected classes of employees,
Yes.
and it is helpful to understand what those classes are and what those protections are. But a role that attorneys can play, for me, it's I think of myself, I'm a really a business advisor who happens to be a lawyer. And where my legal training I think is particularly helpful, I study governance a lot, and governance is about decision making. And within communities, it is important to understand who has what power to do what, right? And that is ultimately governance. There's governance with a capital G, right? And then there's governance with a lowercase g, which is just about what is the shared decision making? How is power distributed among the members? And when a community of employees is forming inside a company that is the employer, there is a high need for transparency about the governance of that community. Who has who has access to the information about what happens in there? Who has a right to know what happens in that proverbial room, right? Who has a right to set the agenda? Clarity about all of those things is really important. And yes, having somebody, whether it's a lawyer or not, but somebody who kind of understands governance and transparency and why those things matter and how they relate to community, I think can be really helpful. And I want to say, I, I'm sharing some critical things. I
Yeah.
support the idea of communities within companies. Community is about belonging, and we all have a desire
Mm,
to belong. And we spend more time at work than we do any other place in our lives outside of our home, right? And so we we should be able to find our community, to find our people, to find meaning, to feel belonging when we go to work. So I think those are a good thing. I think they're a better thing when it's really clear what's the intent behind it, and it's really transparent what people can expect from it.
I love it. I love that you're like, I'm a business advisor that just happens to be an attorney. And I'm like, spoken like an attorney. I mean, like, and I think, you know what, like we need that balance. We really do need that balance. Okay, we're at time, but I want to ask you one last
That went
question.
fast.
Okay, what what are some questions I should ask myself before I say yes to joining any community, whether it's, being in an employee resource group, or it is shelling out a few $1,000s for some very, very sexy community that's in vogue right now, or my PTA, or something that's more maybe, let's say, regional, like FBOM.
Yeah.
What should I ask myself before I just dive in?
Yeah. Yeah. I have some thoughts about that. One quick clarification, FBOM's not regional. Since we moved online, we have members in multiple countries all across the US, all time zones. So we're not anymore. We started locally, but we're now much broader than that. But I think the questions, so it's similar, Aparna, to the questions that you might ask yourself before you buy a product. What is my need? Like, what is the need
Mm,
that I have? And is this going to meet my need? So communities exist for all kinds of purposes. Are you looking for joy, right? A book club is a community. Do you get
yeah.
joy from meeting with a group of people who like to read the kind of things you like to read and talk about them? So then you ask yourself, is this going to bring me joy? Is it going to add something to my life? And is what I'm going to get from it worth what I'm going to have to put into it? Oh, I'm going to have to commit to reading a book once a month now. Do I really have the time for that? Am I going to start enjoying it less, when it becomes a to-do item? And so whether it's a
Hmm.
professional community, a personal community, related to a hobby or business, what is it that you're looking to get out of it? Can that community provide it at a price that you're willing to pay? Whether that price is, time, information, or money, I think is key. What I've learned from FBOM over the years is that sometimes people aren't really clear what they want or what they're looking for. And so they can stumble into the community and then it resonates or it doesn't. So, for example, FBOM is a peer support community for women who are company founders and business owners. We're there to support each other on the wild ride of trying to build a successful company.
Yeah.
We are not a sales network. This is not a place to come sell to women like your thing. That's not what it's about.
Hmm.
And some people join not knowing that that's really what they wanted. And they come in and then they're disappointed, like, well, nobody bought my thing. Like, because that's not why anybody's here. They're not here to buy your thing. And then what we do there, what it is for, either resonates or it doesn't. And people will move on until they find the community that fits their particular need. And our needs change over time, right? Like
Yeah.
they do. In the early days of your business, when it is just you or you have a small team, having a squad of people around you going through a similar experience might be really, really important to you. 3 years down the road, when your business needs have evolved, that might not be the thing that you need anymore, and you might move on to find the other thing. So it's whether it's joining or deciding whether or not to stay or renew, the question is always, what do I need? Am I getting it here? And am I getting it at a price that I'm willing to pay? That value exchange feels good.
I've never thought of it as a value exchange. And I think that might be why me personally, have been disappointed sometimes when I join a group and I'm like, oh, like, I don't like it. Something's amiss. But I've never asked myself the question of like, what is it that I need? And is this the thing that's going to help meet that need? Or
Yeah.
am I just joining it because my friends are there?
Because I feel like I'm supposed to. Somebody else said I
Hmm.
should, or somebody else joined it and look at what they got out of it.
Yeah.
Your needs might not be the same as theirs. And one thing, I get asked a lot about sort of the rise in communities targeting women. And
Mm.
I can sometimes feel really annoyed by that. Like, oh my gosh, do we need another one? I've come to understand that annoyance is a product of privilege. And the privilege is I have found my people, I have found my community. It feels good to me. So why am I seeing all these other communities when I've already found the thing that I need? But the truth is, communities exist to meet needs of people. And if that need doesn't exist, that community won't survive, right? So if there's a community that's out there and it's thriving, somebody's benefiting from it. Somebody's finding value. If they weren't, they wouldn't keep showing up and that community wouldn't exist. So I try to keep that in mind when I feel that urge to be like, oh, one more. Like, oh, well, the community I'm a part of is meeting my needs, but it's not meeting everybody's needs, and no one community can meet everybody's needs. So, brava to whoever stepped up to the plate now to try and meet a need that they weren't
Oh,
having
I
met somewhere
like that
else.
perspective. I like that perspective. I also hear like you don't need to have FOMO. Like if you have what's serving you, carry on,
Yeah, it's hard
right?
not to
Like,
have FOMO. We're humans, we all want to be a part of the club, and we want to be a part in the business. We want to be a part of the successful club. So we want to know, where is the success happening? But success looks many, many, many different ways.
I too suffer from an occasional bout of FOMO. I'm actively working on it because yeah, you can't be in 30 different groups. You got to be pretty selective. Thank you so much. I
This was
feel
so
like
fun. Thank you.
I've learned so much from you in 30 minutes. I mean,
Well, I'm
I
always
have
learning from you, so it feels good to have given something back.
thank you. Thank you so much. I have pages and pages of notes and so much to think about. I yeah, I'm absolutely grateful for not just your time, but I feel like how you show up in the world and how you show up for other entrepreneurs. May we all be like you as we grow into our lives and our leadership. So truly.
Sure, sure.
Um, and to everybody else that's been watching, thank you so much for being here with us this morning. And we'll be back next week to continue talking about all things community. Have a great week, folks.
Thanks, Aparna.